Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Stephanie Plunkett, Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Norman Rockwell Museum, and we are so pleased that you're able to join us for this Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies exploration of the art of fantasy inspired by fairy tales and mythology. This special program is created in conjunction with our current exhibition, Enchanted, a history of fantasy illustration, which will be on view through October 31st here at the Norman Rockwell Museum. We have a wonderful program for you this morning, and that actually begins with a little bit of a sweep in looking at the art of Norman Rockwell and his own flights of fantasy, with a talk that I'm going to give called Real and Imagined, Fantastical Rockwell. And that will be followed by two panels. Our first will begin at 10:45 and go to 11:45, called The Fairy Tale and Fantasy Art with author and folklorist Jane Yolen and illustrator Ruth Sanderson. And our second panel will begin at 12 o'clock and go until about 1, and that is called The Making of Myths with artists Victo Ngai, Justin Gerard, and Ian McCaig. So we are going to get started, and I'm just going to begin sharing my screen so that we can look at a little bit of Rockwell. And if you do wind up having questions along the way, please do not hesitate to put your questions in the chat, and we will try to pick them up and respond as quickly as possible. So let's see. Hopefully everybody can see that. I'm going to actually start with a George Lucas quote, which is, Rockwell recorded our fantasies and ideals and gave us a sense of what was in our heads and our hearts. An ardent and perceptive observer, Norman Rockwell was a persuasive visual commentator whose realist paintings for popular periodicals inspired belief by millions in the innate goodness of humanity and the achievability of the American dream. Nurturing our love of fantasy in ways that the artist himself may not have fully perceived, his carefully constructed illustrations for the Saturday Evening Post and other magazines, and for hundreds of 20th century advertisers and products, are the work of a consummate mythmaker who understood his audience's deepest desires and spoke to them from the heart. And you're seeing him here in his Stockbridge, Massachusetts studio, which is on the museum's grounds. As art critic Peter Sheldall aptly noted, Rockwell's precisely observed facts squared with deeply serious hopes, and his pictures constitute an accurate graph, as we have, of what being an American, a fictive condition always, could feel like. Despite the complications of life, or perhaps because of them, Rockwell pictured a world that he and many others wished to inhabit. His recurring motifs, children enjoying the company of their elders, patient parents, newsy but benevolent neighbors, as we see here, resourceful girls and women, and later principled freedom fighters, reflected mores that society embraced but sometimes fell short of fulfilling. Embedded within his humor and pathos were conceptions of heroism, patriotism, individuality, and equality, ideals that have helped sustain us in good times and bad. His artworks, though realist, portrayed ideas rather than actualities. And it is perhaps no surprise that Rockwell's psychoanalyst, Erik Erikson, who is seen here, observed that the artist painted his happiness, pouring his energy into whatever happened to be on his easel at the time. Storytelling was Rockwell's passion, as well as a shield against uncertainty and despair. For 60 years, his willfully hopeful constructions, aspirational fantasies, celebrated commonalities, and helped us to galvanize America by envisioning its dreams and desires, as with these World War II covers featuring the fictional hero Willie Gillis. Film directors George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who have explored themes of fantasy and science fiction in their work, are both admirers of Rockwell's narratives and collectors of his art. Washington Post film critic Anne Hornaday once remarked that the two directors' movies have tapped into the mass audience's most fundamental hunger for archetype and myth, an observation that could likewise be applied to Rockwell. Committed to entertainment, these three master storytellers offer something more profound. Early in my career, Rockwell said, I discovered that funny ideas, pure gags, were good, but funny ideas with pathos were better. Not only pathos, though, he said, just something deeper. An idea which is only humorous doesn't stay with people. But if the situation depicted has some overtones or undertones, something beyond humor, it sticks with people and they like it much more. Rockwell's love of fantasy was first inspired by literature. Many of his artworks feature men and boys engrossed in reading, like the young man in this 1923 boy reading adventure story, highlighting the importance of literature as a source of inspiration generally, and to Rockwell personally throughout his life. Captivated by the stories of Charles Dickens, which his father read out loud in the evenings after dinner, Rockwell was inspired as a boy to draw their characters as he listened. His father read, he said, in an even, colorless voice, the book laid flat before him to catch the light, the full light of the lamp, the muffled voices of the city, the rumble of a cart, and a shout becoming the sounds of the London streets. As a lifelong reader of Dickens, Rockwell adopted the author's literary view, observing the world around him for its rich narratives and characterizations. By his own report, Rockwell's parents supported his decision to attend art school after seeing an impressive drawing of Ebenezer Scrooge, the cold-hearted miser who eventually finds redemption, which was created as he listened to a reading of A Christmas Carol. In the 1920s and 30s, Saturday Evening Post cover illustrations by Rockwell and his friend and chief competitor J.C. Leyendecker promoted a fantastic holiday-themed symbolism, showcasing jolly, plausible Santas, posh, religiously inspired costume pieces, and Old English scenes infused with literary overtones. One of these, Rockwell's December 17, 1938 cover painting, which the Post titled Mr. Pickwick Sets Out by the Muggleton Coach for Christmas at Dingley Dell, features another of Dickens' well-known characters. A retired businessman described as a generous and affluent gentleman, Samuel Pickwick was the founder and chairman of the Pickwick Club. Written for serialized publication and later compiled and sold as one story, the Pickwick Papers tells of the club's members who travel around England by coach to examine specimens of human life in places remote from London. In Rockwell's painting, the beloved protagonist is portrayed with an overflowing basket of holiday bounty. As a fledgling professional, fresh from his studies at New York's Art Students League, Rockwell gained entry to the publishing world at McBride, Nast and Company. Many fiction-based assignments for children's magazines followed, including a series of 5 illustrations for Ralph Henry Barber's story, The Magic Football, a fairy tale of today. This was published in St. Nicholas magazine in December 1914. Despite its fantastical underpinnings, the story must have rung true for Rockwell. Principal character Billy Piper, like Rockwell, was not known for his athletic prowess, but had daydreams of being a star football player. Responding to the boy's impassioned wish, a spindly fairy, who you see here, emerges to give Billy a magic football to aid him in his quest. In Rockwell's illustration, this flight of imagination is set against a realistic setting, a well-appointed sitting room filled with books, art prints, sculpture, brushes, pens, and ink bottles. Over the mantel hang a Rembrandt-like Burgomaster and what appears to be a copy of Millet's 1857 painting, The Gleaners, featuring 3 women toiling over the remaining stalks of wheat in a field after harvest. At the end of the story, Billy wins the big game for his team, to much acclaim, but also experiences, quote, a sorrow. The magic football is gone, indicating that next time, talent and effort alone will be his salvation. Also something that probably rang true to Rockwell. The Land of Enchantment, another Rockwell flight of fantasy, inspired by works of classic fiction, appeared in December 22nd, in the December 22nd, 1934 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, though it was not originally intended for publication. Conceived for a commission Rockwell received from a man who wished to hang a picture over the mantel of his children's room, the project was curtailed when the financial crash of 1929 forced the client to cancel his order. But the Post encouraged Rockwell to develop the idea, his first double-page spread for the magazine, which could be clipped out for framing. At the time, Rockwell lived in New Rochelle, New York, and displayed the painting in the town's library, where it continues to hang for public enjoyment, and it's actually on view at the museum right now. It's really fun to have it on the walls. In this rare mural-sized painting, Rockwell contrasts the worlds of fantasy and reality by surrounding 2 children boldly painted in the foreground, engrossed in their books, against a paler backdrop of slowly emerging storybook characters. He further distinguishes figures from background by echoing the children's posture with 2 strong diagonal thrusts, subtly designed, that begin just above their heads and flow outward to the lower corners of the art. Carefully inscribed around the canvas perimeter are the names of many beloved characters from fairy tales and fantasy, from Old King Cole to Rip Van Winkle, Alice in Wonderland, Little Red Riding Hood, Robinson Crusoe, and The Cat and the Fiddle. Decades later at the Post, whimsy was still the order of the day, as evidenced in the 1955 cover illustration Art Critic, which happily is in the Norman Rockwell Museum's collection. In a recurring Rockwell motif, fantasy and reality exchange places as paintings in a gallery literally come to life. Despite Rockwell's use of what is referred to in cinematography as deep focus, when foreground and background objects take on equal clarity to create a sense of hyperrealism, the artist's imagination has clearly taken the lead. Rockwell once said he envied students who swooned when viewing the Mona Lisa because he never felt such passion. Perhaps he viewed himself as a more analytical artist, like the one examining a 17th century portrait in Art Critic. With typical humor, he replaced the indignant woman portrayed in his charcoal study with one more alluring in the portrait frame. Rubens inspired by a drawing of that Peter Paul Rubens made of his first wife, Isabella Brandt, and by Rockwell's photography of his own wife, Mary Barstow Rockwell. To further enliven the piece, a quiet landscape in the background has been supplanted by a group of Dutch cavaliers, which you can actually see here. He wasn't getting quite enough activity from that beautiful landscape. And the cavaliers, of course, seem to express concern over the students' close proximity to the art. The lighthearted nature of this 1955 work belies Rockwell's own reality. During an emotional year, Mary modeled for the painting's portrait while under treatment for depression at the nearby Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge. In addition, the couple's youngest son, Peter, was severely injured in a fencing accident at college. After 4 days at the hospital, Rockwell wrote with relief, Peter out of danger. An art student at the time, oldest son Jarvis posed as the young man, looking a bit too intently at the flirtatious portrait. Art Critic is one of Rockwell's most popular and extensively analyzed works. His photographer, Bill Scoville, believed that it gave him the most trouble and agony of any. He had a terrible time finishing it, he said. At least 13 different charcoal and color studies preceded the finished painting, and here you see Rockwell in his studio surrounded by all of them. Remarkably created just to appear on the cover of a magazine that would be on the stands for 1 week. Similarly themed, Rockwell's 1946 painting Framed invites the viewer to ponder what happens when patrons vacate museums and artworks are left to their own devices. In this painting, a security guard has inadvertently framed himself as impressionist and historical paintings look on from the wall behind him. Fireman also relies upon this favorite Rockwell pictorial device, utilizing a frame within a frame to convey a layered message. Published on the cover of the Post in 1944, the year after a catastrophic fire destroyed his Arlington, Vermont studio, complete with his costume reference and prop collections, Fireman plays a visual trick on the viewer. Using trompe-l'oeil techniques, Rockwell releases a stream of smoke from a smoldering cigar left on the mantel below, to the dismay of the 1890s era firefighter who is trapped within his frame. On the lookout for props, Rockwell purchased an antique gilt frame for $1 in a junk shop. It was empty, he said. I felt it had to be filled. So you see the frames in this picture and the pictures in the frame. Legends of mermaids and mermen have enchanted humans for millennia. In the journal Christopher Columbus kept during his voyage of 1492 to 93, he recorded testimony from a crew member who claimed to have seen mermaids. English explorer Henry Hudson's 1608 logbook contains a similar account. These wonders of the sea, long a staple in literature, surfaced frequently in the golden age of illustration, about 1880s to 1920s. In the works of such artists as Howard Pyle, Edmund Dulac, and Arthur Rackham, all of whom Rockwell admired, Rockwell's Mermaid, a whimsical fantasy and his only nude for publication, builds upon the tradition. During his student years, Rockwell sometimes escaped to the seaside resort of Provincetown, Massachusetts, where he studied with painter Charles Webster Hawthorne and took the opportunity to work directly from nature. The idea for Mermaid formed from his memories of these early experiences. Following his previous post cover of a prim bride-to-be and her fiancé in a somber New England town hall, Mermaid, with its sea breezes, white sand, and rosy-cheeked nymph, was a refreshing diversion. Walter E. Merchant, an 81-year-old Gloucester, Massachusetts lobsterman, posed for the painting. But imagining the turmoil that might ensue if a neighbor were to appear as a nude female protagonist, Rockwell wisely hired a professional model from New York. Oh, I'm sorry. For the fishtail, he purchased a 12-pound pollock from the Berkshire Fish Company, and after photographing it, gave it to his neighbor, John Malumphy, who served it as his restaurant for 2 days. Rockwell was disappointed with the reproduction of the painting, which was published on August 20th, 1955, because he felt that his wispy clouds, designed to give the picture a mystical effect, were lost in the printing. Some readers called the cover obscene, but most found it humorous and delightful. Completely suspending disbelief, perhaps due to Rockwell's convincing portrayal, one wrote and noticed an egregious error, explaining, this is a quote, "It is well known to all competent marine biologists that the species, Aqua Homo sapiens, to which the mermaid belongs, is warm-blooded and mammalian, in contradiction to fishes, which are neither. As would be expected, a mermaid's tail is very similar to that of any other marine mammal, such as a seal, and has a smooth skin covered with soft fur, not scales." So as usual, Rockwell was being corrected by his audience, which he often was. In Lunch Break with a Knight, Rockwell's final narrative cover illustration for the Saturday Evening Post, the lines between fact and fiction are again creatively crossed. Published in 1962, when the magazine sought to present itself as a modern publication in changing times, this witty anecdotal work was a refreshing reminder of an aesthetic that has all but passed. Nestled among the mounted knights in a museum's hall of arms and armor, a weary night watchman, bathed in moonlight, his feet dangling from his perch, takes time out for a dinner break. Little does he know that he is being warily observed by the grand horse on whose pedestal he rests. During the American 20th century, the profusion of print media supported the work of numerous talented illustrators who, in concert with the literary and commercial establishments, were purveyors of imagination and fantasy. Rockwell's ability to look beyond the surface of things into the hearts, minds, and imaginations of his readers offered a vision that set him apart. Thank you very much, everybody. I would be happy to take any questions. We have a little bit of time before we start our next panel, which we're very much looking forward to. So, oh, thank you. Nice comments. I'm so glad people enjoyed that. It is really, really fun and interesting to see Rockwell's forays into fantasy. I think it's something that he greatly enjoyed. I think with that, we will take a little bit of a break. And I would suggest that we come back at 10:30, which is in about 7 minutes. And we will look forward to getting started with Ruth and Jane. Okay? Thank you, everybody.
Hi, Jane. It's Rich Bradway at the museum. Do you know how to unmute yourself? I can direct you. There's a little microphone in your Zoom window down on the bottom left-hand corner, and it's probably already muted. So if you click on it, there you go. You're good. All right. We'll be back in a couple minutes.
Okay.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We are excited to have you back, and looks like we've got a fantastic group both on Zoom and on YouTube and across a number of virtual platforms, and people are zooming in from all over the place. So we're so pleased about that. It's such a great pleasure to have Ruth Sanderson and Jane Yolen with us today. And to give you a sense of where we're going with this panel, many of today's popular fairy tales first appeared in the collections published by Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, and Hans Christian Andersen. The stories, however, evolved from folklore passed down from many generations. Jane Yolen and Ruth Sanderson are with us to discuss the portrayals of fairy tales and folk tales in their work, and the antagonists who manifest themselves as tricksters, evil stepmothers, and other beings with fantastical abilities and powers, and we're going to find out who their favorite characters are, which I'm excited about. Ruth and Jane are actually longtime friends. They have collaborated on many projects, and they have brought many, many stories to life, both those that are retold and those that they have created personally. But their collaborations include such books as Hush, Little Horsey, Where Have the Unicorns Gone, and The Arch of Bone, among others. And I am very pleased to introduce them now. Best known for her illustrations of classic fairy tales such as The 12 Dancing Princesses, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Goldilocks, and many others, award-winning artist and author Ruth Sanderson's paintings have been published in more than 80 books. Her beautifully rendered artworks can also be found in books such as The Enchanted Wood, The Golden Mare, The Firebird, The Magic Ring, and The Snow Princess. In addition, Ruth is co-director of the low residency MFA program in children's book writing and illustrating and certificate in children's book illustration programs at Hollins University. Her recent books include the beautifully illustrated and extensively researched A Storm of Horses, the story of Rosa Bonheur. And she is currently working on The Dwarf's Tale, a young adult retelling of Snow White that will be fully illustrated in Scratchboard. Her art is currently on view in our exhibition here at the museum in Enchanted. And we are featuring a work from Ruth's 12 Dancing Princesses, which we are very honored to say the entire book of illustrations is in the museum's collection. Jane Yolen is a celebrated American writer of fantasy, science fiction, and children's books. She's the author or editor of more than 350 books, including The Devil's Arithmetic, a Holocaust novella, and her other works include the Nebula Award-winning short story, Sister Emily's Lightship, the novelette Lost Girls, Owl Moon, The Emperor and the Kite, the Commander Toad series, and How Do Dinosaurs Say Goodnight? And Jane has also collaborated on projects with each of her 3 children. Jane's books and stories and poems have been recipients of many awards, including the Caldecott Medal, Nebula Awards, Christopher Medals, and World Fantasy Awards. And she has also won the World Fantasy Association's Lifetime Achievement Award, the Science Fiction Writers of America Grand Master Award, and the Science Fiction Poetry Association's Grand Master Award. 6 colleges and universities have given Jane honorary doctorates for her body of work. Welcome, Jane and Ruth. We are so happy to have you with us.
I'm delighted to be here. You're about 50 books off. I have over 400 books now.
Oh my goodness, Jane. Well, we thank you for that. The contributions that you have made are just extraordinary. We are actually going to be running some of Ruth's images in the background as we speak, but I guess I'll start out with a question, and that is, how did you each get drawn to the subject of fantasy and folklore and fairy tales? What is it about those themes that have been so meaningful and interesting to you?
I was reading at a very young age, probably about 3 or 4, and my parents had a series called the something like the World book, and I was reading all about King Arthur because that was capital A was the first in because it was alphabetically, and I fell in love with the Arthurian tales, and that was my first entry into it.
Thank you, Jane. How about you, Ruth?
My grandmother was a librarian, so I grew up with books, and a treasured book in my parents' house was growing up was a big collection of Grimm's fairy tales that belonged to my father and was illustrated in black and white. And when I was able to read, I just read that book over and over. So yeah, I've always loved fantasy in particular and fairy tales.
Now, did each of you study formally, whether art or writing? And did you have a sense that this was an area that you would begin to explore?
I knew early on I wanted to be a writer. I was writing in first grade. I was, the class writer. By the time I got to Smith College, I became the class poet. So I was always writing, but getting into children's books was by accident. And it's a long story I won't go into, but it was predicated upon a lie. An editor wrote to me and said, "We hear you're the top writer at Smith College of your year. Do you have a manuscript you're working on?" And I didn't. I had no manuscript at all, but I said I did. And then she invited me to come in 2 weeks and bring my manuscript with me. And I thought, I can't possibly write a novel or a short story in 2 weeks, but I could write a children's book. I thought it was easy. Turns out it wasn't.
So yes, I also in first grade was designated the class artist. I was the artist. So I drew horses, especially because I loved them and wanted one. So it was wish fulfillment at a very young age. And
did you ever actually get your horse? I know you have horses now, Ruth.
yes. It took till I was 13 and my parents made a deal with me. I did not want to go to prep school. They wanted to send me to prep school and I wanted to stay with my friends in town. And so they said they would buy me a horse if I went to prep school. So I did that.
Yeah.
And I was very lucky. He was my best friend for all the years of high school. And I still kept him at my best friend's house. So I stayed connected with my friends. It was great.
We're looking at the screen, an image that you did for an original story. I was wondering if you might want to say a little bit about The Enchanted Wood. It's just a beautiful book.
So The Enchanted Wood was my second fairy tale. I retold The 12 Dancing Princesses, and it got good reviews for the writing as well as the art. And I felt like I wanted to create an original tale based on, you know, my favorite things about fairy tales. Things happen in three. There's often three brothers. It's always the youngest one who wins the day. So the motifs of fairy tales and the woods are my favorite place. I always have been. The dark woods are, you know, often depicted in fairy tales. So I wanted to combine my love of fairy tales and my favorite things and create so almost like a personal myth, you know, and it has a joint hero heroine. So I wanted to do that too. So both boys and girl readers could identify with the characters in the story.
You know, go ahead, Jane. Thank you.
It's interesting to me that Ruth and I came to horses in very different ways. She owned a horse, but I got to ride Lipizzaner horses and train on them when I was younger because the Spanish Riding Academy brought horses across over to America. So that was my horse thing. Once you've ridden a Lipizzaner, you can't ride another horse because they're so highly trained. You yourself become highly trained, and you expect the horses, the ordinary horses, to do what the Lipizzaners can't do. But I wanted to point this out. I've seen Ruth and sat with Ruth in her studio when she's working, partially because my whole family were part of her group of people who posed for her. And when you said earlier, in the earlier section, you talked about Rockwell either saying or being called, saying that talent and invention will be his salvation. I wanted to add hard work because
Yes.
sitting in the studio with Ruth, I see that she has talent. I see that she's innovative. But what I also see, and what you see in Rockwell's work and with the great artist's work is how without that hard work in the studio every day, nothing happens. And I think that people very often who are not in the field think, oh, it's magic and it just occurs. And it's not. The base of all art is that hard work. Certainly you see that in Rockwell. Certainly you see that in Ruth's work. They love what they're doing, but by gosh, it's hard work.
That's actually a very important point, Jane. And you're right. Rockwell was basically in the studio 7 days a week. And Ruth, I know that you are probably the same. I wonder, Jane, what is your work schedule like? Do you, as a writer, have a schedule set out for yourself where you are saying, you know, this is my writing time?
I'm usually in my writing room at 8 o'clock in the morning, maybe sometimes 7, and I go until about 8 o'clock at night. There's no such thing as a weekend. unless someone plans it for me, or unless I have to go and do signings or go and do storytelling or whatever. COVID has not bothered me because I'm used to being, alone in the studio. And I think that that's how you get to 400 books. That's how you get to 300 books. That's how you get to 6 books, is sitting there and doing the hard work. But finding what inspires you. And I think Ruth and I, Rockwell clearly too, are inspired by stories, by the looks on children's faces when they're hearing stories, the transformative nature of stories. And I think that that's what's been the sort of ground base, that and hard work.
Ruth, do you want to add anything to that? I know that you are, as Jane said, an incredibly hard worker. And even just from your postings of your recent plein air paintings, I can't get over what you accomplish. Cannot get over it.
Yes, I've basically, except for travel and when I'm in the house, I'm sort of working all the time. One has to have a very agreeable spouse to put up with an artist or an author, I think, who is sort of always part of you is working, whether you're eating or wherever you are, the ideas are always churning. And I have worked 7 days a week for most of my career. And now I take weekends off and do plein air painting for fun outside. So I do art as a living, and what do I do for fun? Art.
My children knew that if they saw me in my workroom with my fingers on, in those days, the typewriter, they would stand at the door and wait until I looked interruptible, or they would go and get themselves, a peanut butter sandwich. They didn't need mommy to do those sorts of things. So that by the time they were teenagers, not only were they completely competent in many ways, but they all became book people. And all 3 of my children have had books published.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. And Ruth, that's the case with your children as well, isn't it?
Yes. My younger daughter, Whitney, has written, I think it's up to 20 books now. We have collaborated on 5 horse stories for Random House, which she wrote, and I illustrated their middle grade, actually their chapter books. And yeah, she's a great author. And my older daughter, Morgan, is also a writer and working on stories herself now. And I'm sure that eventually she will be published as well.
Yes, we have a joke in our family that my children, each of them has over 30 books published. And my daughter Heidi, when she's talking to groups, she says, "You think I'm a big success?" She said, and 30 books are not to be sniffed at. I think it's actually close to 40 now. And she said, "In my house, they say, aren't you cute?" And yeah, there's a big line between 40 and 400, but 400 happened because I'm now 82.
Well, and you've worked pretty much every day, as you say, other than if a vacation was planned for you, I'm sure. An interesting question came in, and I think it is something that we wanted to touch upon a little bit in our conversation. What character archetypes are you drawn to? And, are there specific characters in fantasy or folklore or fairy tales that you like and have kind of developed?
My favorite is Baba Yaga, the great Russian witch. She loves young women and she eats the boys. She's this force. You can't kill her. You may bargain with her. You're not ever sure she's going to keep to her end of the bargain, but you can bargain with her. But she's just phenomenal. So I also have a tendency to want to rewrite many of the stories so that the girls are not just someone to be passed to the highest male bidder, to just be married off to the strong young man who is not interested in them particularly. He wants to go do good deeds. And so a lot of my stories that have folkloric elements in it totally restructure some of the old stories to do just that, or to point out the fallacies and the faults in the stories. All stories have faults, but they follow, especially folklore, follows the line of what's going on in the culture of the day. And if the culture of the day is young women to look beautiful and stay indoors and let the boys go off and do whatever it is they do with tilting at windmills, that's not what's going on now. So for me, it's either finding those stronger archetypes or turning some of the archetypes that we have into something else. Here's an example. When I taught children's literature at Smith College for 7 years, but I also teach it a lot of time. And when I talk about folk tales, I say, let's really look at some of those old stories. You know, the one where the prince finds the beautiful girl in the glass coffin, pays, in the story, he pays money to the dwarfs to let him take the girl the dead girl in the coffin back to his house. Nobody ever says, what the heck does he want with a dead girl in a glass coffin? We don't go there. But I did. And really, if one of his guards hadn't stumbled and the girl turned over and the apple came out of her mouth and she sat up, I can just see, if you follow the logic of the story, then the prince says, take her back. I don't want her. She's alive. You know, so we don't talk about a lot of these undercurrents in these stories that we've accepted for years. And I think it's important for us to look at them, to take them apart, to put them together, maybe to turn them upside down. Or if we're going to tell them exactly the way they've been passed down to us, then know what we're doing when we do it.
Jane, did you receive any resistance when you began to ask those kinds of questions of the stories that for so many years had just been absorbed and accepted?
The kind of resistance, I got a lot of, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought of that kind of response. But I did get a resistance from an interesting group of men who were folklorists, who said that what I was writing was fake lore, not folklore, but fake lore. And you then have to step back and ask yourself another question. Did the story just emerge full on by itself with no human intervention? Or were these stories that were told sometimes for entertainment, but also at the same time for entertainment, to teach the children of the day what the rules were? And they were saying, we shouldn't touch them. These are old stories. If you write anything that looks and smells and feels like a folk tale, now you're doing something wicked.
Wow. Thank you. Ruth, how about you? Do you have certain archetypes or characters that you feel particularly drawn to? I'm loving this gnome here. I don't know if you want to talk about him.
Probably the previous one was actually a strong female character. So I try, even when retelling, say even the 12 Dancing Princesses, my youngest princess ends up being the heroine, but she chooses the gardener, to marry a gardener at the end instead of the prince or one of the princes, even though she's ridiculed by her sisters. So, you know, I always do try to make the female characters in my stories, you know, if it's a romantic tale like Cinderella or what have you, make them strong and have, you know, have character and, you know, have agency and make choices for themselves. And in the case of the Golden Mare, this is Yelena the Fair, who is kind of a magical character, and she ends up very cleverly saving the day. You know, when there is a problem with the Sultan wanting to marry her. So, yeah, and in
I want a hat.
In the Enchanted Wood, the main character is the wise woman's daughter, who is also very wise and basically tempers the male character and proves and lets him know that, you know, the staying on the path is better than taking up the sword, you know. So yeah, so I try to instill, you know, strength in my female protagonists.
Yes, you always do. And I did want to ask you, just because the costumes here are so beautifully painted and ornate.
I made that.
Wow.
I made her costume. It's actually a robe I got at a flea market, and it didn't have this fancy gold, but I invented that. But I made her a hat as well, and, you know, used the Russian motif. Again, it wasn't quite this fancy, but I actually have this this costume. So I do a lot of research. Have a lot of books on costumes.
Those of us who pose have posed over the years know that you have to climb into the most amazing assortment of costumes. I remember when you were doing oh gosh, The Secret Garden, and I was two different women in the older women in The Secret Garden, and she had these elaborate sort of Victorian outfits for these women in heavy wool, and it was the middle of summer. Almost impossible to breathe in them. But
Jane, we have a couple of images of Ruth's coming up where we do have portrayals of you, so we'll look forward to pointing those out for sure.
I want to ask Ruth, that wasn't Rebecca Gay, was it? Posing for that?
For which one?
No,
she posed in Cinderella as the fairy godmother.
Ah, because this looks very much like Rebecca.
It does.
Yeah.
A question came in, and I think it's an interesting one. Oftentimes, stories evolve over time at each telling. Are there folk tales that you are particularly fond of that depict that evolution? Have you found that certain stories have changed, or that you may have changed them? Well, Jane, you were just addressing that to some degree.
I've done a lot of collections of folk and fairy tales, and when I do the research to decide which stories to go in, I very often find similar stories in other places and decide which stories seem the most exciting tellings, then put them in, so that over the years I found dozens and dozens and dozens of Cinderellas and dozens and dozens and dozens of Baba Yaga type characters. It depends where you're looking. If you look in Russia, you'll find Baba Yaga, but if you look in another country, you're going to find a different version of it. There are trickster stories all over the world, and sometimes there are Nancy trickster stories from Africa, or they could be stories about Raven the trickster or Rabbit the trickster. So they're all very often they're very similar stories, but it's fascinating.
You know, Jane, just in terms of what you just said, a writer just wrote in to say that Baba Yaga is the foil to Hellboy in the Hellboy graphic novel series by Mike Mignola. So I guess characters keep finding new stories and being reinvented in new ways.
I know that because I wrote an introduction to one of Mike's graphic novel series.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. We're all related.
For sure. Ruth, do you want to say a little bit about what's on the screen, maybe?
Oh, yes. I think at some point we were going to talk about antagonists, and
Yes.
and this is the dwarf from Rose Red and Snow White, and he's the only antagonist in my stories that I completely made up. I did not find a model for this one. I just
Maybe
made
that's a
him
good
up.
thing.
And actually, he reminds me a little of the Rockwell piece that you showed with the the gnome
Magic
or
football,
or
yes.
whatever. Yeah, and so he was really fun to invent. The greedy dwarf.
I bet.
You know, here's an interesting thing, the Rumpelstiltskin story. And this picture reminds me of it too. If you think about the Rumpelstiltskin story, and this is something that I found out that I've never seen it anywhere else. Here you have a character who's like a greedy dwarf, right? He has a big nose, an unpronounceable name, and he is forced to live on the outskirts of town, of the community. He's not allowed in. The only thing he's allowed to do is to trade gold or jewels or whatever. It's the only thing he's allowed. Now, it's not a complete huge step to get from there to saying that character in folklore has consistently been consistent with Jews. I'm Jewish. Those kinds of characters make me very, nervous, because those are the characters that you can tear apart, you can throw into the fire, you can kick them in the rear and get them out of town because they're not in the place where they're supposed to be. But they are almost always portrayed that way. And it's like giants, we have giants in our head and they're a certain way. Dwarfs, they stand for something else. So it's interesting how over the years, these characters have become codified. And some people see them one way, some people see them the other.
Jane, do you find that some of the roots of the characterizations come from prejudices against certain groups? Do you think that is an innate aspect of some of the earlier folk tales?
Certainly you have the stupid giant. So that a stupid giant you're allowed to kill. There are certain characters in folklore you're allowed to kill. You're not allowed to kill a prince. You're not allowed to kill the king. You're not allowed to kill the beautiful girl. You're allowed to kill the wicked stepsisters who all, are portrayed as nasty. It would be interesting to spend time with a psychotherapist who would look at these stories that have come down to us. Some of the stories are simply stories to make sure that your kids stay on the right path.
Mm-hmm.
Don't talk to strangers. Don't talk to wolves in the woods. Don't open your door to strangers. They're all the sorts of things that a young, well-bred, or maybe not so well-bred young woman is taught in the old days. The boys are taught, be brave, take your sword, go forward, God is with you, et cetera, et cetera. So that this becomes a way of codifying in story what people want their children to know. So a lot of times these stories are really doing double work. They're entertainment, but they are also, at the same time as that they're entertainment, they are teaching you the things that you as a young man or a young woman growing up needs to know to have a good life.
Yes, thank you. Fascinating. I was wondering if you might each describe a little bit about your creative process, because you do tremendous research, and I'm wondering how you come up with ideas. And, is there a sort of the most exciting or most interesting aspect of your process? And are there stumbling blocks along the way, things that you find to be very challenging as you're developing projects? Ruth, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So my favorite stage of a book is actually the planning stage. That's the idea stage, the conception, the vision of the book as a whole. And I always do really small thumbnail sketches and a storyboard, or two or three. Sometimes I do many to really plan the flow of a book and how it's going to look. And it's always in black and white. It's always in full value. So I plan the darks and lights, and, you know, in very small size. Each double page spread is probably, you know, 1 or 2 inches by maybe 4 inches. And I'm just getting the essence down of what I want that picture to look like. And then for the next 8 months or year or 2 years, I have to execute my vision. And that's actually the most difficult part, is executing it and staying true to the initial vision of that. And usually emotional, some kind of emotional moment is what I like to portray. So that, I guess the challenge is to try to stay true to your initial vision. And sometimes I put that storyboard right next to me when I'm working on a painting to try to make sure that I'm getting the same emotional impact that I felt when I was conceiving it.
Speaking of emotional impact, this is an incredibly powerful piece. Would you mind saying a little bit about this?
So this is the 13th fairy, who is the evil one who curses Sleeping Beauty, retold by my friend Jane here. Lovely. And I believe her daughter is in the background as one of the good fairies posing.
Which one is
Might
she?
be a number of good fairies. She's definitely the one right to the right-hand side of the evil fairy. And the woman who did my costumes, Nan Hurlbert from Munson, Mass, posed as the evil fairy, and a friend posed as the queen and the child. So yes, the emotional, the thrust of the curse is what I was trying to portray. And the challenge also in designing a picture book is, where are the words going to go? You know, do you leave a space in the art that's light, or do you put it in a box at the bottom? So it's always a challenge to design stories, books. And then where's the gutter? Where's that page going to turn, and not to put anything important in that space. So,
given that this was something that Jane wrote, Jane, what was that collaboration like? Did you discuss the story before Ruth began the illustrations, or how did that work? Was there a lot of back and forth? There's the story there.
Upside down. Ruth and says, I'm supposed to be doing a book of this is not Cinderella, this is
Sleeping Beauty.
Sleeping Beauty. And they told me they were going to write the story around my pictures, and they haven't done that, and I don't know what to do. So I told them that they should call you up and have you do it. I'm just warning you. Then they called up and they wanted me to do it, but for no money. And so Ruth said, I'll give you a painting or two afterwards. I said, done. And the problem is, and that little orange fairy with her hand over, orange girl with her hand over her bosom is my daughter, who is now up to book 40 and so it's easy to retell a fairy tale if you just read it enough times and get to understand where the movement is. But this one was more difficult because Ruth had painted all the paintings. And sometimes she would have a big scene, which in the book, the storytelling itself is 2 lines.
Mm.
And I had to reinvent new parts to the story to stretch it out in order to fill the space that she'd left for the story itself. So it was a more difficult project than it would have been if we had done it the other way around, where I had written it first and then she illustrated it.
Mm-hmm.
The pictures were so stunning, you know, you had to just keep going.
They truly are stunning. But I guess, did that mean that you were kind of filling in areas that had not yet been invented, Jane?
That's right. I mean, I remember I had a whole section on the spiders that had spin their webs all over the place when the girl was sleeping. I think that's right, isn't it, Ruth?
It was a long time ago. I don't remember exactly, but I do remember you did a wonderful job filling in, yeah, the spaces I left for text. It's like, I just estimated, you know, and yeah, sometimes you probably didn't have enough room and had to be really quick. And then other times, yes, there was a lot of space and you were stretched to expand that part of the story.
You know, the funny thing is, I look at these pictures that Ruth has done, and 40 years ago, when we first met, I probably would have written a poem about the horse or the man. But these days, writing as an 82-year-old, I might write a poem from the point of view of the bush and the brush here that is keeping people out. I think that as we get older, these stories take on different aspects to us and for us, and we're never seeing them completely with the innocence that we first saw when we were children ourselves.
And I think that's another reason why I feel that, you know, people choose to novelize fairy tales, because there's so much essence there. And like Jane said, you might want to take the point of view of a different character. And in my case, you know, I've always loved Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but I want to retell it from a dwarf's point of view. And the only way I can do that is to write a novel. So
yeah.
And that's what you're actually working on now, Ruth, isn't it?
yes, I've been working on it
And
for a while.
Scratchboard, I know you're so proficient in as a painter, but also in that Scratchboard medium, which I wish we had an example here. They're quite extraordinary. Would you want to say a little bit about that project?
So, well, I fell in love with Scratchboard in particular when I wanted to illustrate The Golden Key, which was a Victorian fairy tale by George MacDonald. And then since then, I've been doing a lot of work in Scratchboard, and it sort of took over for a while. And yes, you know, I guess I never really took to the Snow White story. You know, I've never retold or illustrated it as a picture book, but I have read other versions, novelized versions, and I just got an idea that perhaps it was a dwarf that made the magic mirror for the queen, and what would be the consequences of that when he discovered what she was going to do with it and what she did with it, because he becomes friends with the Snow White character. So it's been a long time in the making. I kind of work on it here and there, but I'm determined to finish it by the end of this year. It's very close. So, but then I have to illustrate it.
Right.
It might be another few years. So
I did a Snow White novel, and
yes, I love it.
It's the problem with novelizing is you can't just sit with that small little very tight story anymore. You have to embrace it, and you have to enlarge it, which means you're finding new characters that haven't been in the books before, or who haven't started them before. And it has all of the problems that a novel has, just a plain everyday novel, but you've got these characters who have always been sort of stand-ins for other things, for this one is the good guy, this one is the bad guy kind of thing. And it takes a lot of work to do that kind of a novel. And then, Ruth, that you're going to illustrate it as well, it gives me heart attack.
It might be my final project. It might take me another forever till the end of time.
I doubt it, Ruth. You're just going to have to go off on another painting excursion to take a break after that.
Once I finish the text, the pictures will grab me. I just really need to finish the story first. It's funny because in picture books, I often will work both ways. And I've done a few sketches for this, but I really need to do to finish the story first. And yes, as Jane said, the archetypal, evil stepmother, she, I can't make her a cardboard character. I've got to give her depth and a reason why she wants to kill, her, her stepdaughter. So it gets dark. It has turned into a young adult story, not a middle grade story. So it's dark.
There's a question from the audience, which is very interesting. How do you relate to a younger generation? And do you have to think differently about your stories based upon, maybe when they're created and who they're created for? Or are you really just creating your story first and then it finds its own audience?
I talk to my grandchildren. I mean, I have 6 grandchildren, and they each have a variety of interesting and some of them outrageously outspoken ideas about what I should be doing. Nana, you can't do that anymore. Nana, you can't say that anymore.
What would be an example of something they said you could not say or maybe write about?
Well, I think just making someone evil without why, or making a girl ugly and that makes her bad, that sort of thing. But also they're giving me all the time stories of themselves and what they're doing. I have grandchildren who are, I have one grandson and the rest are granddaughters, but the grandson is the most sort of outrageously wonderful of the group. And I have one granddaughter who is her pronouns are we, us, they, so I'm learning all of these things that I might not have otherwise learned because I love my grandchildren and they are also wonderful and interesting and will tell me if they don't like what they see in my writing. And in fact, I've written books with 2 of them now. And each time I'm very careful to listen exactly to their critiques, because if you're writing with someone else, you listen to them very carefully. And they are right there in the now, where I'm not.
That must be very exciting to actually work with them on projects. Mm-hmm. Ruth, how about you? Do you have that sense of the audience you're speaking to particularly, or do you shift your point of view based upon that?
No.
Yeah.
I'm writing and illustrating what I love, and I guess I just hope that other people react to it. I guess in the case of fairy tales, I'm trying to do, sort of a timeless look, and yeah, hope that it appeals. Now that you're showing this piece, over the years, young women have contacted me saying, they read The 12 Princesses as, when they were growing up, and the images just stayed in their mind, and now they're getting married and they are actually designing the wardrobes of their their wedding party based on my costumes for
Wow.
from the 12 Dancing Princesses. In fact, there was one woman who wanted to fly me down to Florida to do a painting of herself in one of the dresses and her husband. And at the time I was just too booked up and I could not do it. So,
Wow.
so that has happened many times that the images, even though they're 15th century costumes, have just appealed to the imagination of young girls and women, and stick with them. They stick with them.
And you did design and sew these costumes.
Oh, no, I did the Snow Princess, but I worked with a costumer from Munson,
Yes.
who was a professional costumer, and she did costumes for the local summer theater. So most of these costumes we just borrowed from the wardrobe that they had, and she did make the youngest princess costume, and she was so knowledgeable. In fact, I often over the years conferred with her on costume design. She created all the hats, which they're not all the princess cone hat. In the 15th century they had all these different types of hats, so that's why the princesses are not generic. They are all individuals.
I want to have, well, I could no longer wear it, but I want to have the costume that's the turquoise one on the left.
That the what?
The turquoise costume on the left of the pictures
Oh.
Yes, that's beautiful.
with the
That
drop
would look great on you, Jane.
100 pounds.
I'd love to ask what you both feel are the most important factors in creating a great painting or narrative. Are there particular things that a story or illustrated story should have to have impact?
Gorgeous language, truth, and a forward motion.
Mm-hmm.
I think in many pictures or scenes, it's important to have an emotional, to portray an emotional moment, connection. I mean, not in every scene, but to always have that that element so that the reader can empathize and put themselves into the story. And I use color to create mood. I feel that's important too. So each of my pictures has a color scheme that I create. I often just work from black and white reference photos and create my own colors. And color creates mood. And it's interesting, you were talking about Rockwell's idea that pathos plus a little humor sticks, and that really struck me. And I realized that in many of my retellings, I actually have added a little twist of humor at the end that feels right for the story. It's maybe a little bit of a modern sensibility that I've added to some of the stories, and just change the ending a little. And yeah, that little addition of humor when there's a serious subject is important.
Speaking of humor.
Speaking of humor.
Anybody guess why Jane is laughing?
So, yes, the wise woman, also one of my favorite archetypal characters. And Jane is the archetypal wise woman in real life as well as a model.
Ruth, how did you recruit Jane to become your model for this character?
Oh gosh, Jane loves to model. I think she's modeled for every artist that if they're close, she loves to model. It doesn't.
It's the clothes, Ruth.
So Ruth, Rockwell would give very particular directions. He once said that if he hadn't been an illustrator, he would have been a movie director. So he would give each model very, very specific directions on how to pose, how to express, create expression. Is that something that you do as well?
Absolutely. In fact, those little thumbnail illustrations I was talking about, I take them, when I do a photo shoot, if there's a number of different models, I'll take those little sketches that, I just make out of my head, and then I position the people, in the scene, based on my little sketches, and then tell them what's going on and try to get them to emote a little emotionally in the photo. It's a little easier with adults to do that. Sometimes, if it's a young child, it can be a little tricky, but for the most part, I use children. I think maybe Rose Red and Snow White or Goldilocks might have been the youngest children I used, but they were all very accommodating and tried to get into the scene. It is like directing a movie, it's still shots. It's like, you're choosing 15 still scenes from a movie, and you do want that emotional moment.
My granddaughter, Madison, who I've done 2 books with and is now in law school, she did a lot of modeling for you.
Mm-hmm.
And she loved it. She loved doing it. I think that this picture for me, it's the connection between the two, one sleeping and one not, but you feel that they have made a connection somehow. And I think it's what's going on between them, not anything else. It's almost as if he knows she's there, but he's not speaking yet. He's not talking.
Mm-hmm.
And looking and saying, maybe I should just hit him with the stick.
Looks like that's about to happen, actually. We have a nice comment from Alice Carter, who spoke last night. Thanks, Jane, for the great advice, gorgeous language, truth, and forward motion. So greatly encapsulated. I'm wondering, while you are working, do you ask for advice or comment on a piece as your story progresses, or is that something that you would prefer not to? And I sort of interrupt my question. Is this Jane also up in the upper right-hand corner, Ruth, as Mother?
Yes, this is Jane behind me as well. That's the original painting.
Yes.
Back there. I thought it happened to be in my cabinet, so
it's really wonderful.
Pulled it out. That is Jane. And that's my magical Mother Goose. I had to add fairies and elves to my Mother Goose, of course.
Of course, it's a beautiful painting.
The elves are keeping house for Mother Goose.
He had me sitting on the arm of an easy chair, so that she could spread the back. It would look like we were flying.
Oh, that's fun. Okay.
That was fun.
Did you have the costume on?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The costume isn't always exact. It sort of simulates, and then I'll alter it a little bit.
It's really wonderful.
Thank you.
So actually, do you ask for advice or comment, or do you prefer to get through a project and then, kind of put it out there?
Both ways. Both ways. I have a writing group that I'm in contact with every once a week, on our good days, once a week. During COVID, we were Zooming a lot, all with women who are professional children's book writers. But my daughter lives next door, and I can always ask her to read something if I'm a little weary or wary about it. And she pulls no punches. She just tells me. But I'm the same with her. She asked me to read her stuff too.
That's great. How about you, Ruth? Do you tend to like to move through something before checking in with people?
Well, in terms of writing, I certainly share that. And the novel, of course, I'm showing a lot of people and getting a lot of different advice, because that's new for me. But of course, you work, when you're doing a book, you work with an editor who gives you feedback, and also, an art director who often gives you feedback. So, but then once they approve, sketches, then in terms of paintings, I usually don't ask advice in the middle of a painting. No, I have a pretty strong vision in illustration where I want to go, and then it's just great guns going ahead to execute it.
Yep. And we have a question from, I'm sorry, Jane, did you want to pipe in there a little bit?
Ruth has a long history of being one of the fastest painters I know. She used to be able to push out these gorgeous Renaissance-looking paintings in 2 or 3 days. I think she's slowed down a little bit to maybe a week. But it's always been, we're in the same, I helped start a group of called Western Massachusetts Illustrators Guild, and where they show their stuff. And she always seems to have a new painting to show, or paintings to show.
Yes.
It's those 7 days a week. And yeah, this one probably took me 3 weeks, Jane. So they're not all fast. It depends on the complexity of the scene. My recent biography of Rosa Bonheur, I have an 80-hour painting. It's yeah, and that's over a number of weeks, not just 2. Yeah, because I often work on multiple things at once, so it's hard to judge exactly how many hours. But I did log my hours for that particular project, and sometimes it'll take me 20 hours just to compose a picture before I even start painting. So it depends on complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, occasionally I have done paintings in 3 days.
We have a question from the audience, actually from our director, Lori Norton Moffat, who writes that beloved illustrator Jerry Pinkney, who many of you may know, actually passed away very unexpectedly this week, and who will be so greatly missed. Retold many classic tales, casting characters as persons of color to make them more accessible to young children of color. Have either of you rewritten classic tales and illustrated them to decenter whiteness and make them more accessible to children and parents of color, or maybe created other unique stories for that purpose?
I think both of us have. My stories, of course, I don't illustrate. So, but I have in the various books over the years, when I did collections, I always was very careful to try to have stuff from everywhere, people of color, but it's a little, these days, a little, you have to be careful, because own voices means that if you're not that person, you have to be extraordinarily careful or knowledgeable to use someone else's story in your story. So that's right now we're in that tipping point. But if you look at my collections, especially, there are stories from Africa, from India, from the southern borders, from China, from Japan, from Korea, indigenous people's stories from all over the world. But in that case, very often I will not retell them. I will tell them as, I will present them as told from within the culture.
Yes, thank you, Jane. But those are important points. Ruth, any thoughts about that?
Sure. I mean, in general, my fairy tales have been, Western fairy tales. So I'm sticking with the tradition of, of the ethnic group that the fairy tales are originally told in. Mm-hmm. My recent, the book I just finished, which will be out in March, the biography of Rosa Bonheur, I did a lot of research on, who else might be in the pictures in the background. She obviously was French, so I'm depicting her as close as possible to how she looked. But there are horse handlers that are Black, and a lot of African presence in the backgrounds of the illustrations and street scenes, museum, what have you. So because there was a big presence in Paris at that time, So I wanted to show that. I even put Dumas, the author who has Haitian descent. He wrote The Three Musketeers. He's actually in the final picture looking at her painting of the horse fair because he was there in 1850. He was in Paris. And so I thought, well, he probably went to that exhibit where the horse fair was shown. So I have him sitting on a couch in the background.
I have to say that those originals are just absolutely amazing. Ruth was kind enough to bring them to the museum to show us when she was here during the summer our sculpture competition, and the research and the detail are just amazing. When does that book come out, Ruth?
It should be out in March. However, the boat situation I know is a little problematic right now, and I don't know how it will be next year. I do know a few people that were supposed to have book launches and the books didn't come in. So hopefully by March, and that is the 200th anniversary of Rosa Bonheur's birth. So that's when we wanted the book about her life to come out, and about her painting of horses here.
That will be exciting.
Painted the Horse Fair, which is the largest painting of horses you will ever see. It's been hanging at the Metropolitan Museum of Art since the late 1800s, and it's 8 by 16.5 feet wide. And I wanted to know, how did a woman in 1850 do this? So that's what my story is about, basically.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable.
Thank you.
Well, I have two examples up on the screen of books that you have both collaborated on. I'm just wondering if you might tell us a little bit about these and maybe where the ideas came from and how you decided to work together.
Both of them were very different. I wrote Where Have the Unicorns Gone? And then we asked Ruth to do it. She wanted to do a lullaby book of horses. And I think it was going to be a board book. Ruth, is that true? Is that true? Am I remembering that right?
No, they turned it into a board book, but no, I think it was originally a picture book.
Picture book. And so Ruth and I discussed that one, and then I wrote it in rhyme. I guess they're both written.
They're both in rhyme.
Yeah. But Where Have the Unicorns Gone came to Ruth fully fledged, I guess.
Okay. And Jane, what is it about unicorns that do you have a particular love of that type of character?
Oh, absolutely. You know, they're horses on steroids. And only girls can tame them. So, you know, I mean, come on, that's a gimme.
Ruth, wow. There's a beautiful series that we're going to be passing through from that book. Would you want to say a little bit about these?
So I tried to do something a bit different with this book. It's so evocative, and you know, unicorns are magical. They're kind of almost your archetypal. So I did a different technique where I made a texture with a palette knife on the surface that I was working on, and then I kind of glazed over it. So in the corner here, you can sort of see in the waves, there's sort of, it's very textural. So I played with that a lot, and this actually was the original cover, and what you saw was the paperback cover. This was the wraparound of the original hardcover cover. So it was more symbolic and evocative.
It's absolutely beautiful. And I think we have another coming up here.
Yeah, I just love Jane's poem, how, you know, it's like taking unicorns through time, and each time, you know, they go down to a body of water, and they go down to the pool, the hidden pool, or I can't remember. I should have the book so I can read the lines, because they were just so beautiful. So I wanted to have my paintings as evocative as possible, to mirror Jane's wonderful evocative text.
The last page.
One more.
Has a picture
Ah,
there. Yeah. I happen to own this painting. I love it.
Oh boy, it's amazing.
If you look carefully, you can see the unicorns within the water.
Right. And you can also see that, you know, a little bit that palette knife texture is still there, is underneath the painting.
But the
Showing
translucency of the water, just amazing, beautifully done.
Thank you. I was just at the beach in Newport, Rhode Island, and I was mesmerized. There was a place on the cliff walk where yesterday morning it was just so windy and the waves were just exploding. And I hadn't been to a place like that on the shore for many, many, many years. And it reminded me of this painting of the unicorns. And now I just want to paint ocean pictures and put unicorns in them again. So you might see those coming up. We'll see if I
would look forward to that. Absolutely. Absolutely. I guess maybe a last question to ask you is, you know, what motivates your work, and what aspect of your work have you found most rewarding, or is there a project that you are particularly proud of?
The next one.
The next one. That's what Rockwell used to say. Yes.
Once I have finished with something, I mean, I'll still read it at visits with schools or whatever, but I'm on to the next. I'm always, and I write a poem a day that I send out to over 1,000 subscribers, and many of them are fantasy poems. And it's just, what's going to happen today? What is the new thing today? I think if I weren't interested in that next thing, that new thing, I wouldn't be still writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. That keeps you moving forward, as you said in your earlier statement. Ruth, how about you?
Actually, I think almost the same. I am looking forward. We are driving our own lives, and you know, our own personal myths, and our, you know, what we want to accomplish, and we are moving forward and looking forward, and that way, yeah, that's the motivation, is kind of what's next, what's the next idea, what's the next vision, what else do I want to say in art or in writing. But I have to say, you know, you're showing Arch of Bone here. This was such an incredible opportunity to illustrate Jane's book, which is coming out in just a few weeks. Jane, is that correct? I think it's coming out in November. And again, I hope it makes it on the boat here before Christmas. But you know, Jane retold, well, not retold, but sort of a continuation of the story of Moby Dick, and it just a wonderful fantasy story for middle grade readers. And I illustrated in Scratchboard. It's really only my second book that for children that I've illustrated in Scratchboard. So I'm really excited by.
They are stunning pictures, stunning.
Mm-hmm.
And Jane now has 3 of the pictures.
That's exciting.
I'm also a collector. The book starts with a young boy, a young man. It's 1864. There's a knock on the door. It's early morning. He lives on Nantucket. Nobody comes to the door at that time. His mother's been sick for much of the year, and his father's off on a whaling voyage that is long overdue. And he opens the door and he sees a man he's never seen before. And he says, "Who are you?" And the man says, "Call me Ishmael."
Mm-hmm.
And we're in Moby Dick territory.
Mm-hmm.
His father was was Starbuck, who was the second in command, who did not have enough wherewithal to tell the sailors that he was taking over the ship, because the captain had gone bonkers and was going to kill them all, which he did. And so the boy then runs off with his dog into the in a boat into a storm and is marooned on an island. So we go from Moby Dick to Robinson Crusoe in about 6 chapters.
Wow.
It's
And then
wonderful, just wonderful.
but they wanted to have some pictures in it, and they showed me some ideas that they had, and they were kind of, yeah. I said, you need to look at Ruth Sanderson's work. She's
Mhm.
scratchboard now, and the scratchboard will bring you right back to that period, right back to that time,
Yes.
and will pop, because scratchboard pops in a way that just black and whites don't. And they took one look at her work and they went, oh my God, we want her. And she worked incredibly fast to get it in time.
Yes.
COVID shut everything down, and I'm supposed to be giving a reading, an in-person reading at the Mystic Mystic Connecticut
Mystic Seaport Museum.
the Seaport Museum
Yeah.
on November 6th, and we don't know if the book's going to be here.
Oh, so frustrating.
Oh.
Well, I think you got to do it anyway, right?
To
But
read.
I love the Neil Gaiman quote here. Jane Yolen is a phenomenon, a poet and a myth maker who understands how old stories can tell us new things. And I think you have both done that for so many people. And it has actually been just such an honor and a pleasure to speak with you today. And I thank you so much for your time. I know everybody online enjoyed it. We have so many laudatory comments, and we can't thank you enough for being here today, but also for your body of work, which has just brought so many important stories to light.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
Stephanie. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for being with us. We are going to take a short break, and then at 12 p.m. in about 15 minutes, or maybe a couple more than 15, but 12:15. So at 12 p.m. we will be back here with Victo Ngai, Justin Gerard, and Ian McCaig. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hello, hello, folks.
Hello, it's good to see you.
You too. And good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome back, everybody. And hello, Victo and Justin and Ian. We are thrilled to have you with us. And we are just going to start with a little introduction of everybody because our next panel is called The Making of Myths. And we're very, very honored and pleased to have Victo Ngai, Justin Gerard, and Ian McCaig with us to talk about this. But just a little background. So Greco-Roman sculptures of mythological figures carved thousands of years ago expressed the power of the gods and of the myths themselves. These ancient tales have been favorite subjects of poets, storytellers, sculptors, painters, and illustrators throughout history and into modern times. Our panelists will discuss their interest in mythology and approaches to portraying capricious gods and other figures who entice humans to perform impossible tasks. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to the artists. Born in Hong Kong, Victo Ngai studied art at the Rhode Island School of Design. And in her career, she has won numerous awards and accolades from her peers for her bold color palette and inventive designs. In 2018, Victo was the recipient of the Spectrum Gold Award for book illustration and was awarded the Advertising Gold Medal from the Society of Illustrators the following year. She has illustrated advertising campaigns for McDonald's, Apple, Johnny Walker, American Express, and numerous other companies. Justin Gerard's fantasy paintings exhibit a bold color palette, inventive composition, and terrific wit inspired by the artworks of Arthur Rackham, Palmer Cox, Maxfield Parrish, and the golden age of illustration illustrators. The works of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis have remained constant sources of inspiration for him throughout his career. His clients have included the Jim Henson Company, Warner Brothers, HarperCollins, and Random House, among many others, and his work has been featured in Spectrum, the best in contemporary fantastic art, and the Society of Illustrators Annual of American Illustration. Over the past 30 years, Ian McCaig has designed concept art, storyboard art, and designs for several blockbuster movies. He began his career in cinema, creating artwork for Terminator 2, Judgment Day, Hook, and Interview with the Vampire. In 1999, he was hired as a principal designer for the 3 Star Wars prequel films, as well as the more recent Star Wars movies. He has also created concept art and design for the Spiderwick Chronicles, John Carter, The Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy, Avengers, Infinity War, and others. Welcome. We are so happy to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You forgot to mention I was a stormtrooper in Empire Strikes Back.
Oh my gosh, I somehow missed that fact. I did not realize that. That's a pretty amazing fact.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Very uncomfortable costumes.
Oh, I was going to ask, were you able to breathe?
They just couldn't hear.
Oh,
they'd yell action, I'd be waiting. And they tell you where to go and you can't, no wonder those guys can't shoot. You can't see anything in those helmets either.
Well, they look cool, so that's what it matters.
Right.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, we're going to be, asking some questions here, but we invite our viewers to put their own questions into the chat or the Q&A, and we will bring them forward. And what we'd also like to do is to kind of stream some images in the background of the amazing work that these artists have done. And we'll be able to stop along the way and ask them a little bit more about what they created. So I might just start with a question for all of you. And, how did you become interested in storytelling? Were illustrated books important to you as children? Were you, encountering works of art? What was it and how did you get there?
I can go first.
Great.
Very good.
Yeah. So I started drawing kind of by accident. My family moved around a lot. I actually attended like 6 different kindergarten. Because of that, I didn't have any friends, sadly, in my childhood, and my parents were both very busy working parents. And I will go to my mom's office after school, and she was the editor at a newspaper company, and then all she had laying around were paper and pen. So that was what I did. I started drawing to kill time and to entertain myself, and that's how I started the journey. And I guess because there weren't any kids around my age to play with, I started inventing, friends on paper that I will go to adventures with. And I guess that's my, early entry into the fantasy realm. Yeah.
Thank you, Victo. And since we have this beautiful piece on the screen, I wonder if you would want to comment upon this.
Sure, yeah. This piece is actually about reserve savings for like a financial magazine, believe it or not. So it's about being resourceful and save up for, the harsh days, especially, for family. So I'm very honored to be invited, but I also feel like kind of an imposter on this panel because a lot of the work, I do are actually for not for fantasy clients, but I think fantasy just become like a language that I like to use to tell story and to solve solutions.
Thank you. Absolutely beautiful. We're so happy to have you here. Justin, would you like to talk about your beginnings in storytelling and tell us how you got involved?
Sure. I actually, I wouldn't be able to pinpoint a time that got me started on this path. Safe to say that my story is probably similar to Victo's in that parents moved around a lot and ended up, hanging out by myself, just drawing quite a bit. And in a similar situation, my grandmother worked at a print shop and sent me a box of paper one year.
Wow.
And so for an entire summer, all I did was draw. And I don't remember much of those drawings. I mean, they're all terrible, and they've long since been burned, as is my yearly ritual to burn anything that doesn't sell. But I do remember, I remember there were a few that like really, I felt that this was it, that this was the thing I had to do for the rest of my life after having drawn it. I remember one in particular where I drew, it was a tiny little fish swimming in a giant sea. And then I drew a bigger fish after that fish. Then there was even a more giant fish after that fish. And there's, this sort of this tragedy of nature and life about to transpire here. And then on top of that, I drew a tiny little alligator diving in between to intervene between all of this to save the little tiny bright colored fish. And he was going to die. He was going to be killed. It was for certain in my crayon scribbling there. And but there was something beautiful about that. And then up in the right corner of the paper, I had scribbled a sun, and that sun was beaming hearts down on the alligator, so that his sacrifice had not gone unnoticed by the great tragedy of nature. I remember not sure what had just happened when I had made it, but knew that this was it. Whatever this is, I'm going to find this in my future, and I'm going to have this with me. I need this as part of my life for here on out.
That's wonderful. Wow. Thank you. And this amazing apocalyptic scene. Can you say a little bit about it, Justin?
Yeah, I have to thank the people who've kind of supported me on Patreon and Twitch for this. During the pandemic, kind of didn't know what to do with myself, like many of us, I guess, like who had been interacting with our friends and our community, our tribe in many ways, at conventions and shows and galleries. And then suddenly we're not allowed to. And we're stuck at home and probably spinning our wheels, losing our minds. And so I started doing more online stuff. And this was part of it, doing just painting and talking to people who are watching while live streaming. And so I can't say much about what the story is here, other than this is probably just me processing, emotions that were going on during that time as we kind of were all getting used to this new normal in the world that was. And anyway, I was having fun, kind of just painting with like-minded people online, and this is one of the products of it.
Wow, that's really wonderful. So you were painting and live streaming at the same time.
Yeah, I've ever since the pandemic started, I felt that I was missing that element of community that I had before, and so this was kind of my way of approximating it. And now that we're even coming out of the pandemic a bit, and people can start to get back out and go to these shows again, thankfully, I'm still probably going to keep doing it. I find that it is actually a very enjoyable thing, and perhaps it is going to be part of the world moving forward, that we are a little more interconnected online. I mean, what we're doing today is a great example of it, that we're able to reach our community and interact with our community in this way. I think is wonderful.
Absolutely. We are so fortunate to have hundreds of people online, and we would not have been able to do that if we were just live. So you're right. That's one of the great advantages of this format. Ian, welcome. Tell us how you got started in sort of moving towards art and fantasy themes. Love to hear about that.
It's a little different. We moved around maybe every 3 or 4 years and then settled in Canada. My parents are from up here. And I did most of my first things in the town that I live in right now. I disappeared for 30, 40 years. It took me to get back here to actually buy a house, and this is home though. But I've never been in just one place. The pandemic is the first time that I've not traveled in a year. I work where the films are. I work in London or in Australia or LA or San Francisco or wherever it happens to be. And wherever I go, I end up in a room like this one, in front of a drawing board. And when you're drawing, you're never alone. You're there with a host of characters, and they're noisy and crazy. And usually for me, I love to stagger outside the studio and just see nature and see real people again. So not a lot has changed for me, actually. I'm still in a room like this. I still stagger out and see nature. And I'm very, very lucky in Victoria, because it's kind of been like New Zealand on the island here. We haven't had a lot of cases. People have always masked up and been very careful and stuff. So we're able to see each other on the streets and walk through the woods and all those things. So the horrible thing is standing this far away from the rest of the world and watching the terrible things that are happening, the catastrophes are happening everywhere, because the pandemic it is up there with the worst of mythological nightmares. And to be outside the window watching that happen to all the people you love, it's been hard.
Very true.
How I started drawing was just, I wasn't going to be an artist ever. I didn't take art in school until quite late. I just assumed everybody drew, right? Because first thing I remember is holding a pencil. I think my dad was trying to write an exercise book for men, women, and children. Little children. Wow. in the 50s and 60s. And women didn't exercise back then as far as the bodybuilding world was mostly concerned. So this was a groundbreaking book. What made it really groundbreaking is he wanted everyone to be wearing kilts, because he's very Scottish.
Wow.
And I was raised, playing in a bagpipe band, and I wore a kilt and I Highland dance over swords and things like that. So nobody would illustrate it, so he had to teach himself to draw. And I was 3, and I would hide under his drawing board, and curses and pencils and paper would rain down from above as he tried to teach himself. And all these art books everywhere, because he didn't know where to start. So I had all these things, and I would just look at them and copy them, draw them. And I think that's how I started. But again, since Dad was doing it and I was doing it, I assumed everybody did it. So my great love was books. And I read, I still do, I read voraciously. It doesn't need to have pictures, because I do the pictures. And the reason I love books so much is my head fills up with images, and then I run to a piece of paper and pour them out before my head blows up. And I think that's really where it all came from. For years and years and years, I was just this illustrator of everything I read. Sorry, losing my voice just a sec.
And we've got a very famous character on the screen
Oh,
Tell us a
he
little bit
was,
about this.
I drew him long before the Gandalf from the films. And again, it was like Justin was saying, I just did this for fun. This is for a birthday card for my daughter. There's a little Gollum in the corner going, I love you.
That's great.
But I was going to say, and Victo, it was about your image as well, that it doesn't really matter what it's for, right? Mythology and fantasy and all this is just a wonderful costume we get to put on real life. And you get to talk about some really dark and serious and uplifting and wonderful things. You know, strong emotion makes us back away anyway. But if you put these costumes on, people stay because they're entertained and they're delighted too. They just have to get closer and see, what is that? And so you can talk very intimately about all kinds of things. That's what fairy tales were for. You know, that's why they're going into woods and meeting horrible wolves and fighting terrible giants. Those were realities to the people back then.
Absolutely.
So, and we still have those realities. We still have all those terrifying things. The strange thing for me is that a long time ago, fairy tales were for everybody. You know, the family would go watch a hanging, and then they would come and sit around the fire and they tell stories. Today, we're very protective of what we call childhood. And we don't let them see certain things. They don't talk about certain things. And it doesn't feel right to me, because kids experience darkness just as much as we do, and understand it even less. So I think these kind of stories are even more important for them, right?
Absolutely. And actually that leads to a question that has come in, which is, you know, are these archetypes that you are painting and presenting helpful for people today? What do they represent to us? Justin, you've got this amazing work on the screen. I wonder if you would maybe want to address that and say a little bit about this piece.
Yeah, this is inspired by Tolkien and some of the events kind of going on behind the scenes, referenced in the Silmarillion. So, you know, events directly preceding those of The Hobbit. And they're just really wonderful moments. The Silmarillion in general is just, you could illustrate for your entire life and still not get through a tenth of it. And it's been wonderful to watch artists try, like Ted Naismith. I love following his work for that reason. There's just so much wonderful, interesting stuff. And like you mentioned, that there is elements that feel true to our lives now. One of the things I love about fantasy art, I think, is its ability to personify psychological struggles that we have through, you know, monsters and wizards and magic, and that they aren't just these elements, you know, that you're actually this character battling some other character, but this can be a way of processing your feelings about life and about your experiences with other people. And I think art for me, for a long time, this scene included, are me trying to process my feelings about things I'm trying to overcome or think through or just understand. And for me, visuals have always been the way that I've done that. Better than any other format, they've helped me kind of express those feelings and then also understand them for myself. I love making images for that reason, that so many times they're a journey that I don't necessarily know where I'm going to end up or what's going to be revealed in the image until it's painted. And so I tend to really enjoy images of struggle, of conflict and chaos. And so most of the images are going to be either the moment before the chaos or the moment of the chaos in my work. I find myself more drawn to that kind of thing. And again, much of it is psychological, trying to overcome something that you're working through in your own mind.
Yeah, thank you. Victo, how do you approach, I'm going to go to Ian next, but here's one of yours. How do you approach thinking about the characterizations? Are there archetypes that you like to explore, or you know, are you just kind of developing things as you go?
Well,
As
before I
just
answer
that,
that,
not necessarily being 100% clear of where they're going.
sure, yeah, before I talk about that, actually I want to continue the conversation that I thought was great that Ian and Justin started, about how myth is still relevant today and like how it exists bigger than just the story is telling. Like I personally feel that a lot. I mean, from the way that I started drawing, I mean, it's in a sense is like an escape for me from the reality, from the small, 4 walls that I was confined in as a kid. In some way, like my mom told me, I forgot about this, but like she said, I will actually reverse what's happening in class in my drawing. Like, for example, if I was bullied at school that day, I will actually become, like someone who like not tell on, but like save the kid from being bullied, like alternative universe. That's something maybe I wish had happened. And I agree with Justin that so much, of the struggle we see, we can project our own difficulties, onto these characters and then get strength from these people. And what I love about fantasy, I'm also a big fan of Tolkien. Although I wish not all the bad guys are dark skinned and all the good guys are like in hindsight. But what I love about fantasy and the archetype is that they're somehow abstracted and also extracted from our reality enough that they become universal, in the sense that like for different people who see it, they might be able to learn different lessons or get different messages from them. And I thought that's really wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very well said.
Can I actually add
Ian,
something?
can you jump in on that question? In
Sure,
terms
yeah, just I've been very lucky and I love all stories, all kinds, it doesn't matter what it is. I don't actually read a lot of fantasy. I did, but these days I like stories about real people, and then I just put horns and wings on them and they sell. Sell better. Like I say, it's a disguise, then you can talk about things. But I find that real people in real life are the best fantasy characters ever. I can't believe what we do. I can't believe what we're capable of. Both the horrifying things and the absolute wonderful amazingness that human beings are capable of too. And I find that the horrible things get talked about a lot more. Quite rightly, they're very dramatic. When if you talk about a war, choices come down to black and white very often. It's the gray disappears, and it's easier for us to talk about conflict that way. But I actually, when I was a kid, I had a copy of Dante's Inferno, and it was illustrated by Doré, and it was those beautiful black and white drawings where you watch Dante go down to the different planes of hell and then finally goes up to heaven. And as he's going down through hell, everybody looks like they're having a great time. They're all naked and they're roiling around and everybody's like, having a party. I mean, with a few pitchforks and suffering looks, but otherwise they look fun. And then he goes up to heaven and everyone's standing there like this, playing their harp, bored out of their mind. And I just, even as a kid, I thought, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. Heaven's supposed to be the awesome place. So a lot of my career is kind of dedicated to trying to portray powerful good, not just powerful evil. And of course, if you're going to do powerful good, you can't cheat, right? And make powerful evil less. So I do enjoy going in and drawing the demons and monsters and the terrible things. But then I like to find the heaven that's stronger and more compelling. And it's harder I think for most people, it's harder to draw. Mostly because good emotions, powerful emotions, love, even just to say the word love, you feel the energy go out of the room when you're talking to film executives. Love. It's not that kind of movie. And it's like, yes, it is. It's good stories. I love stories. And I find that it's because with evil, you can disfigure good and it looks evil. With good, you just have to show the thing. And the thing has to have a context or it's not good. Good is doing the right thing in the face of all the bad choices you could have made. Good is doing something kind for someone and not talking about it. It's a strength, but it's a strength in motion. So
Yeah.
it's a harder thing to portray. It's one of the reasons, Victor, that I love your work so much. It's joyous. Yeah, no matter what it is, it's this beautiful swirls of color, and in your lines and everything, I just find, I find this beautiful light. And Justin, it's not to disparage the battles in the darkness. I love that stuff to pieces.
Well, speaking
And
of
actually-
joyous, this Yoda is really joyous. Can you tell us a little bit about what it has been like to bring some of those characters to life.
Well, just to give credit to Yoda here, by the way, Stuart Freeborn was the head of the creature department for Lucasfilm at the time, and in all the history books, Stuart Freeborn designed this. It was actually designed by, the final design was designed by Wendy Froud of the Froud fame, Brian and Wendy. And you can tell it looks like a Froud elf or creature. And Stuart absolutely oversaw the department and did a lot of great sculpts too, and helped get it very close. I think he helped bring in some of the wisdom into the eyes and stuff, but Wendy did the final. So, and Wendy's a good friend, and it was a real treat to take her character and try and help it into a new form, because we're doing the prequels and we're allowed to digitally animate this character now. So I took Yoda, and I was supposed to draw Yoda from the moment he was born right through to very, very old Yoda. One point is that beard that he ties under his chin like that. So this was just part of that. It was just showing the animators how Yoda could sit and talk at a slightly younger, more spry age. Don't forget he's 800 years old, so younger still, it's pretty old. But yeah, it's fun. I don't have to invent the character. I love to invent things, but I don't have to be the author. I get just as much pleasure out of someone handing me something and letting me put that character on and play them out, perform them. I love collaboration. I love, before, the internet kind of collaboration we're doing now, I love being in a room with people, starting a drawing and passing it along and seeing what it comes back like. It's fun. And I think that's an important part of the storytelling process too. It should be fun. It should make people gasp with awe, but also go, woohoo,
I think that's a really important
I find that in
point.
both of your work. It's just so powerful with emotion. Your battles are practically falling off of the scene. They're so, lively and rich and stuff. So yeah, for me, that's my goal in mythology, and my goal in characters is to find the powerful good. So if you're responding to one, it's either because it's challenging that or it is that, but that's my mission.
Yeah, if I can chime in, I thought it's interesting that Ian said, you said fairy tale used to be for all children, and now you don't feel like that's the case anymore. But I'm starting to wonder, hearing what you say, and also, of course, the influence Star Wars has on the culture. I wonder maybe we just shifted the kind of fairy tale that our children consume. I feel like these are the modern mythologies, and like you said, in the end, they're all story about people. If you strip away the, galaxy, all those costume, and for example, for me, Star Wars is about, it doesn't matter where you come from, right? Even if your dad is the most evil guy in the world, you still decide your own destiny and what kind of life you want to live. And in the end, I feel like that is a fable, that is a fairy tale.
Yes, it is.
For children.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. A lot of what we do in film and so on is for everybody, and whether we like it or not, children watch them.
Right.
If they don't at your house, they will at their friends.
Yeah.
And that's very close to the old fairy tales and things. So they do get to hear things and see things that are maybe older than we would think is appropriate for them. Yeah. But I agree, Star Wars is also about real people, especially the first ones, because he had come straight off of American Graffiti, which was his college years, right? It was about falling in love and having to go off to college and all those things. And all he did for Star Wars was put it in a galaxy far, far away. It's still about growing up and falling in love and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's coming of age.
Yeah,
Exactly. Justin, is there something of that in this piece? It's quite extraordinary.
It's beautiful.
This piece, I think, has more to do with travel and feeling small in a giant, wonderful world full of tons of possibilities, both good and evil, but it is about possibility, and I love backpacking. I love hiking, and there's a group of friends I go out to a lot of the national parks with every now and then, and we'll do 2 weeks in the backcountry of Yosemite or the Pacific Northwest, the Cascades, we love going up into Washington and California. But one of my favorite things is that sense of being up on some ridge or some cliff and overlooking this giant world below, and feeling small, or especially being out at night, out when you're away from the city and there's no light pollution and you can actually see galaxies overhead. I love that sense of wonder at the world. And so I think this is part of that. Again, this is done sort of near the beginning of the pandemic. So there is a sense of like what is coming. There's an ominous edge to a lot of these images from this series called A Plague of Dragons. But hopefully not despair either. Like I hope that in all of them there's hope still. And again, wonder at the new world we have, because we do live in an amazing time, all things considered, that we are, talking to people across the globe instantaneously, that we're beaming pictures, across the globe to one another. I think as dark and ominous as it may seem, like there is something truly magical that has occurred in our lifetime. And so, while a lot of these are certainly set within a medieval fantasy world, I hope that they capture a little of that wonder at I don't know where we are right now and the possibilities moving forward.
Thank you, Justin. Yes, beautifully said, and spectacular work. We have a question from the audience for Victo, and I'm going to go back to the piece.
I'm sorry, I just want to comment on.
Oh,
this.
please go right ahead.
It's really nice, and the moment I saw it, I get that feeling. Like it's not very just simple black and white, like evil or good. It's like mixed. There's opportunity, there's danger, and I feel like that is also, what I realized, like slowly growing up, that like the dark and light is not two things side by side. It's a scale, and sometimes they actually wrap around, whereas the light is sometimes if you cross the line, it becomes the darkest. It's like people say, right, like it's darkest before the dawn. And it kind of reminds me, this piece actually reminds me of the Chinese word for danger, which is 危机. But if you divided that two characters side by side, actually mean danger, opportunity. So I feel like that's also ingrained in the Chinese culture, that everything has two sides. It's kind of like how you play it, and then even with the most devastating thing, there could be something like good come out of it. And I don't know, like I saw this piece and I definitely get that, like even with the overwhelming fire breathing dragons, like you still have that little like sliver of a moon and that tranquility of this like starry sky behind it. So I definitely feel like it has very like interesting mix of feelings.
Absolutely, and that beautiful break in the clouds on the horizon with the light pouring through. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, and the light is mirroring the fire. So I'm like wondering, is the village on fire, or is the sun coming out and a new day starting? It's like a lot of questions can be asked and generate a lot of curiosity about this piece.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a question from Juan, who would like to know a little bit more about the creation of Victo's Utopia. So I'm going to go back to that one and maybe see if you could fill in a few details for our viewers.
Sure, yeah. I feel like the creative process of this is very similar to Justin's like big fish, alligator son. It's kind of a story that, it was for a calendar project called Rockwell, which is no longer in existence, but it's quite a like cool project by a print shop that is themed around frogs. So it's very open-ended. Anything to do with frogs is fine. So that's the only requirement. And I started thinking like, what kind of story can I tell with a frog, and started considering, the shape, the big belly, and one thing just led to another, and I came up with this whole elaborate story about how frogs, they're always, making those noises like ribbit, ribbit, is actually trying to tell, people, hey, the world is ending, you need to change the way you're living. But of course, we're too dumb to realize it. And there's like this, like master frog who save a last piece of land inside his belly and sort of give human a second chance after the world is flooded from, global warming, rather climate catastrophe. Like, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, it's just
Fantastic. I love it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah,
I
sure.
wonder if each of you might say a little bit about your training and how you kind of came to this subject matter. Did you go to, I know that Victo, you did go to formal art school, but did you, for example, Ian, how were you trained?
I'm very classically trained. I did eventually take art in school. It was my last year of what we call high school. It was in Scotland. And I went to the Glasgow School of Art. So went to the Charles Rennie Mackintosh building that's burnt down twice now, along with my thesis. No great loss there, but the building was amazing. And it was, by then I knew I was going to be a writer, not an artist. And I applied to an art school almost on a whim and got in there instead. And so my life kind of did this for a while, where words disappeared and pictures became my principal words. And I was illustrating a lot of classics and getting to know a lot of stories and so on. So I actually, you were saying about the 30 years in film, I started in publishing. I have 10 years as a book cover, record cover artist. I did prints and things. I did advertising and all kinds of stuff. And I still do. I still love illustrating. I still love doing pictures for words because words were the thing that were precious to me. And eventually, 10 years after that, I got into the film industry because they paid me enough to start writing. And I have a 30-year career as a writer as well, which most people don't know because you have to be in that world. I read a lot of screenplays. I have published some books. I have 2 books coming out this year. I continue to take the stories in that closet back there, which is just crammed wall to wall with my stories. And
Congratulations. Can you tell us what books are going to be coming out?
Something called Once Upon a Time in a Sketchbook. So it's a sketchbook with a story. I have a revised version of something called Shadowline, which looks like my art book, but it's a novella on an interviewer that doesn't exist that wrote the book. And he comes to get the interview from me with a secret mission of his own and discovers all kinds of incredible things. He even kills me at one point and that brings me back to life. But it's a fictional version of the creative journey. So it's what happens when an idea comes into my head and comes out the other side as a picture. What actually happened. So I dramatized that as characters and so on. And it was just to teach people how to draw and how to be creative and how to not be afraid of the big blank white page. That's, as you said, it's an opportunity as well as a reflection of whatever you're feeling at the time. So I did 4 years of art school. I have an honors degree in design. I didn't learn to paint. That happened when I left. I went down to London and started working as an illustrator and mostly doing black and whites because I knew how to draw. And then I got this commission to do a record cover for Jethro Tull, who were a huge band at the time, still pretty big. And they were my favorite band. So somehow you have to just level up. When those
Which album
commissions
cover was
come
that,
around,
Ian?
you just have to be better than you are. But there was a wonderful illustrator, Brian Saunders, who just, people these days know him for the stamps he paints in Britain. But he's a wonderful teacher. And he recognizes artists that are struggling. And he saw me trying to paint. And he just called me in and said, Ian, no, here. He put a piece of paper up and he'd do this beautiful wash with watercolor. Let the water do the work. Here, you do it. And I would do it and he'd go, good, do it again. And he just literally had me paint beside him until I learned how to use watercolors. And thank you forever, Sandy. It's just what a gift. It's part of the reason I like to teach. It's part of the reason I like to give back, is I've never forgotten that generosity that 4 years of art school didn't give me. So this piece that was on the screen there, that was digital, but digital is just a new form of oil paint, which is an alternative to watercolor. It's all ways to tell stories. And these days, by the way, I don't see any difference between pictures and words. They're the same. They both can tell stories. They both, carry a little capsule of meaning. And it's how you put them together that tells the story.
Thank
So
you.
that's my training.
Wonderful. Justin, how about you? Were you formally trained, and how did you move in this direction?
Yeah, I was, though, like Ian, I didn't really start, I guess, until afterwards. And I found that I just hadn't learned enough of what I wanted. I couldn't create the things that I wanted. And so I was still casting about for how to, plug the gaps in my education. And this is in the era before the internet. And one of the best resources I had at the time was a library that had a bunch of step-by-step guides. I don't know if anybody remembers that old step-by-step graphics.
I remember them.
Yeah, they had one by Peter DeSev, one by Greg Manchis. And I remember I stole them. And I never gave them back, not ever. I literally took opportunity away from the generations that followed after me. And I don't regret it. They're on the shelf behind me, actually. They've been with me now 20 years. I'll never give them back. One of them, actually, Corey Godby stole from me. So maybe that turnabout's fair play there. But it was wonderful having those as guides, and I'm forever thankful to Manchis and DeSev for their contributions to art education through those books. They both heavily informed my own work early on, and to this day, they're still big influences. Later on, 10 years later, though, after I'd worked in the industry for 7 or 8 years, I was not getting the work I wanted. I was not happy with the work I was doing. Had kind of like an existential crisis almost, that what was I even doing with myself, and decided that I needed to reinvest into my education. And this is, again, it's kind of a hard thing to do, 10 years into your career, essentially. And I ended up going to the IMC and the illustration masterclass and learning from Donato, and Charles Vest was there, and Dan DeSantos, and again, Greg Manchis. And it was wonderful spending time with them. But I would say that after that I studied with Tom Fluharty and Petar Maselzia. And that was probably the best thing I ever did in my career, was seek out professionals who were doing what I wanted to do, and had I felt so much, they had figured so much out, and I wanted to know how. Mm-hmm. And so they were both kind enough to give me some guidance. And I remember with Petar, I actually spent a day in the Rijksmuseum looking at a painting of Rembrandt's, Jeremiah lamenting the burning of Jerusalem. It's kind of a small little painting. And we sat in front of that painting for, I don't know, it was like 3 hours. And he just told me all his thoughts on the painting for 3 hours. And I think I got more in those 3 hours of just looking at that Rembrandt with Petar than I had in, the previous 15 years. And so, I don't know, it's hard to say, art education, if it ever ends truly, I feel like we're all there where we're all going to be continuing to push that further as our entire lives as curious individuals who want to know like how other artists did what they did, and what else is possible out there. And yeah, anyway, that's all I would leave that as a big thank you to all the people who've given me guidance in my career. I would not be here without you.
That's a wonderful tribute for sure. Victo, how about you? What was your training like? And were you moving in this direction in art school, or did that happen later?
Well, I didn't have any formal training until RISD, and I honestly wasn't sure if I would even be accepted. RISD was the only art school I applied, because in Hong Kong, art is not really considered a viable career option. I mean, even now it's still very difficult, very limited opportunities. So, I mean, my parents are quite supportive, but they did tell me that, you know, like their point of view of the stark future if I go into it. So I thought, you know, like I should just give it a shot and apply to one of the best art school in the world. If I get it, maybe, you know, I have a chance at succeeding. And luckily I got in, and I was, you know, one of the poorest student for the longest time. Like most people had, you know, went to art high school, had a lot of knowledge in the art history. Even now, I agree with Justin, and I'm still learning like great artist name that I'm really supposed to know, but I'm still kind of like filling the blank into that structure and, you know, understanding how things influence each other and how they fit together. And then, I mean, the Risley education is very great. Like it, you know, gave me the work ethics that I have. And I think the most valuable thing is giving me a community of friends that I can still rely on if I need some suggestions, some input, some feedbacks on my work. I feel like that is the hardest thing after graduating, not having the critique in class and having, like, especially if you share online, like people tend to be nice and just say nice things, but sometimes you just need like that honest opinion, you know, like how can I push it further, what is lacking. And I feel like having that community is very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And actually, there's a question relating to your comments from Melissa Howell, who's a professor of illustration at SCAD. And she is wondering what advice you might actually have for students these days who are interested in entering the field of illustration.
Well, I feel like the illustration landscape is ever shifting. In some way, it touches on so many different industry now. Like what we're showing here is only a very small example of what illustration can do. So I feel like when we're at school, like we're given a structure and we're being taught a certain way, which is great. But there are also many opportunities. So don't despair if you feel like you're not clicking with the class or the assignment is not interesting to you. I think it's very important to remember why you go to art school in the first place. Like no one go to art school because they want to have a Lamborghini or like a, you know, like we love what we're doing. And like for a while, I almost lost that passion at RISD actually, because I was trying so hard to catch up, you know, I was trying so hard to fit in, that it at some point become not fun. And what saved me was actually my sketchbook, like that I was doing during, you know, like liberal arts, like English 101. And that's what I was still enjoying art. So I think just remember to find a way to hang on to that passion, because it's so easy to lose it, whether at school or when you just have to pay bills and take on jobs you don't love. You know, just constantly remind yourself why you're doing that.
Great advice. Thank you. Ian, would you like to chime in on a little bit of advice for future illustrators?
Yes. There's so many opportunities for artists now that didn't exist when I started. Games and films have bludgeoned with job opportunities. There's a trap there though, and that's that when you're part of a collaborative piece, and everything you do is offered to a director who chooses whether they're going to use it or not, you can mistake that for whether it's any good or not. And it can destroy. I've have so many emails from young artists who say, I took your classes, I did everything you said, I have the job of my dreams, I'm the art director of this and that movie and studio and so on. Why do I want to give up? And the answer is that you train like a Jedi, you train with all these amazing powers, and then you give it to someone else. And you never remember to give it to yourself. So my best advice to not just students, but to professional artists as well, always, always, always have a soul sketchbook. And that's a book. It's different from your other sketches. It's a book that every day you put something on the pages that you're passionate about, something that makes you really excited. It can be a negative emotion too, if you want. It can make you really afraid. But I think if you can capture joy, something you'd run naked in the snow just to see, put it in the book. And it doesn't matter how you put it in the book. Put it in by drawing it or writing it or tearing it out of a magazine or stealing it from a library. Just put it in the book. And don't look back through the book. Just do it every day, so that 6 months from when you started, you go through and you look at every page of the book. And I guarantee, if you were honest about what really moves you, that's a snapshot of your soul. And number one, it will keep you sane. It'll help you stay centered and find who you are and stay passionate about the things you love. And number two, it'll help your job, because when you present a design like this, show John Carter meeting Deja Thoris, and she's already getting married to someone else. And it's that moment where you just don't know the next step. You don't know what happens. You don't know the way forward. That came from something in my sketchbook. It came from something in real life that happened to me. And I put it in there, and it was happy, sad. It was bittersweet. I was happy for the person. I was sad for myself. And you just take a little piece of that soul and you put it inside the design you're doing, and it comes to life. So I recommend that for students. Keep a soul sketchbook always.
I love the idea of a soul sketchbook. Thank you. That's so helpful. How about you, Justin? Do you have a little bit of advice for students? Oh, let's go to that one. Here we go.
Yeah, I would have said the exact same thing that Ian and Victo said. And it's the sketchbook is the number one thing. And that's one, because I love that it's one of those things that it's not necessary to be skilled to have a sketchbook. Like, you need no training whatsoever. My sketchbook it probably looks about the same as it would have 30 years ago when I was just using stick figures. That's all you need to make, compositions of incredible elaborateness and capture your ideas about a scene that you may have read in Tolkien or that you've seen in real life, but want to reinterpret. All you need is stick figures to capture the essence of that idea. And then, hey, maybe 10 years later, you'll paint it. If that's what you need, if you need to go develop the skills in order to actually communicate that scene like you want it to. But the best thing ever is to have it. So I can't really improve on what Ian and Victo have said about that. So I'll add something else, and that is read, write, and world travel are three of the most important things you can do to broaden yourself as a human being. But I also think as an artist or a creative of any sort, they're indispensably important. I don't know which of you it was who mentioned sort of filling up yourself and then pouring it out earlier, but that idea I think is really, really important for your own work. When you're in getting art education, you're going to be doing, drawing formal things, tables and chairs, learning to draw squares and capture light and shadow on form. These are very, very boring things, but they're like knuckle push-ups for your artistic brain. You need them. You have to be training like this, but they're not going to be fun. It's up to you to find that fun stuff and to sort of fill your mental library with those things. And so I've always been a big fan of, if you can, travel. Number one, it's just one of the best ways to get new experiences, to broaden your understanding of humanity, of other lifestyles, of other lives, the ways that other cultures live that you might never have guessed about. All of these things make your work more colorful, more interesting, and broaden your ability to communicate to other humans. So, and to say something interesting too. So I'd also say get away from people. As much as I would say go travel and meet people, there's also some value in getting back to nature too. So every background and all of my images is a place I've been, including this one. It was the ruins of an abbey in the middle of England. I can't remember the name of the place now, but this image is just me trying to recreate the magic of seeing that place at night. Most of the backgrounds in my work, though, are places I have been, and either I'm working from a photo I've taken myself, or I'm just trying to recapture the magic that I felt in that place, like this scene where I had no photo, because this was 25 years ago and no digital cameras, and a Polaroid just doesn't work when you're trying to do night photography in an old abandoned abbey. So I have to just use my memory. But I find those experiences, getting out into the wilderness, into abandoned places, out into nature, out under green leaves and open skies, to be so important to nourishing your artistic soul. So that's my advice.
Thank you. Wonderful advice and comment.
Could I add something? It's just an
Yes.
observation that I saw. I was like looking at the slides while you guys were talking, and I noticed, like, for example, Justin did a lot of dragons, but none of the dragons' design were exactly the same. I feel like that's also one way that artists keep themselves interested, even if it's like a familiar subject matter. And I think it was Einstein who said that creativity is intelligent at play or having fun. And I feel like I see that, like the kind of fun and design decision you make into, like you have into the dragon design. Like, for example, if we can go back to the one that's in the water, there's a dragon in the water, right?
basilisk.
For example, this one, like the scale is much thinner and kind of like resemble that of a fish, right? Because it's like a water dragon. At least that's my interpretation. And then there's another one with the hobbits, and like covered in gold. Like, I thought it was so interesting. The dragon scale resemble gems, like rubies or like sapphires. And I feel like for people who are interested in art and look long enough, these are the Easter eggs that reward the audience. They understand, this dragon doesn't just represent, this danger, but it's also the enticement. Like, it itself is also embodiment of that, like lust and greed. And I feel like small details like that keep artists interested in their work and also make their work much more rich for the audience.
Thank you.
Can I chime in on that too, just for a sec? I heartily endorse the travel. And even if you can't physically travel through books and the internet, but travel to other places, look at other cultures and other mythologies. Dragons exist in every culture of the world, and they mean different things in different parts of the world. I'm working on a project, Korean project right now, for a book that I don't believe has been translated outside of Korea. It's called The Bird That Drank the Tears. And it has a dragon, and that dragon's a plant, a living plant. And it has a different purpose and spirit than something that is greedy and to be feared. And it's the same in China, right? The dragons there are gods and have all kinds of really wonderful purposes with mankind and things that they gift to mankind. And so you can easily get locked into something, especially by television, because it refers back to a lot of European Middle Ages mythology.
Totally.
And I've always thought it's really good to, now go to India, see what they were doing at the same time, read the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, understand that in a different culture, the same archetype appears, but this is what it meant here in this place. And that frees you up too. Now, when you go to do your own mythology, you can take an archetype, but don't be bound by what you thought it was. It can be whatever it means to you personally.
Thank you, Ian. Great comments. And that interconnectivity between cultures is so important to remember. We're getting close to our 1 o'clock hour, but there's a question here that I'd love to bring forward from someone on YouTube. And that is, if you're working on personal work, maybe perhaps even on illustration, how do you decide which ideas are worth pursuing in terms of, how you're going to move forward? And how do you work with, kind of yourself when there's no art director to offer commentary?
So I'm gagging myself because I got an instant answer. All ideas are worth pursuing. What are you talking about?
Yep.
All ideas. It's what you do with the idea that makes it great.
Yeah.
Right? The idea that's worth pursuing is from your soul sketchbook, right? If it didn't give you passion, if you didn't want to do it, hijack it. Find something that you do want to do and make it about that. But yeah, it's got to be something that has meaning for you. But any idea can work. Of course it can.
Great.
Yeah, I forgot, like another wise people said, like there's no lack of good idea. There's always good ideas. Like how do you bring the idea to fruition?
Yeah.
Right? How do you execute it? And what can you extract and distill from it? That's the difficult part.
Great. Justin?
Yeah, there's something I talk about, the Venn diagram of what you're interested in versus what people will pay you for. You know, and it's, I think starting out, like, yeah, you just have to do them all. Get out there and just start doing the ideas that are exciting to you and see which ones hit that narrow overlap. It's dangerous to go purely into that other side though, where it's only the things that people will pay you for. That's when you start to lose your soul and forget why you did this. And like Victo was saying, there's better ways to get a Lamborghini if that's why you're here. You know, this isn't the industry for you if that's what you're after. Like it's better to stay as far on the other side as you can, but it is nice if you can find that narrow margin in between where you've hit the thing that is clearly speaking to other humans, because there's something important there. You know, if it's something that speaks to you and it speaks to others, you know, there may be a reason that's the case and you should chase that.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And I think throughout the past 10 years of me working, I also slowly realizing that you can create your own market. Like, of course, it's nice if you find like a patron or a client that just love your work instantly. But I realized that artists also can educate their audience and educate their client. Like when I was starting out, like a lot of clients, especially, you know, financial clients, they were pushing back on using metaphors with, you know, animals or mythologies to represent Wall Street. But I see that changing. And of course, that's not my sole like doing, like far from it. But like our generation, I feel like of illustrator are very interesting in that and collectively kind of pushing that. And you see, you know, that is changing. Like the client's much more open to it and they're much less literal.
Yeah.
So yeah, we are all part of this organic thing that keep evolving. So what we do have an impact on the entire industry.
Yeah. Plus, I think what people universally like, right? There is the Venn diagram thing for sure, but anywhere what people are interested in is truth. They don't like being lied to. They can tell when you're faking. They can tell when you're copying. They can tell when you weren't interested.
Yeah.
You are unique. You are special. Everyone is. And if you can honestly share that viewpoint with somebody, the truth of that will connect. It's just that that's hard to do sometimes when it is an advertisement for something that has no meaning whatsoever. But for me, I grew up on great books and I grew up on comics. You know, I had a subscription to Superman when I was 4 years old. And, you know, those really don't have a lot of weighty things in terms of literature. And yet, here's a creature from another planet who comes to Earth to help us. And he has no reason. He's not getting paid. He's not getting his Lamborghini. He's not even part of this planet. Why on earth would he stick around and help people? And I like to think it's because he saw something good in us, worth protecting and worth saving. And
Right.
so I took that meaning from that. I gave that my truth. So even if the subject, even if the client, if what you're doing has no meaning whatsoever, bring meaning to it. But make sure it's your meaning and your truth, something that really resonates with you. And that I find always connects to some audience somewhere. So there's bound to be someone in the world that has that experience too.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end our discussion on. It has gone too fast because I know we could just keep talking for a very long time. But we have been so honored to have the three of you on today to share your work and your ideas. And I just want to remind our visitors that these incredible artists' work will be on view at the Norman Rockwell Museum for another week in Enchanted, History of Fantasy Illustration. The exhibit will then travel to the Hunter Museum of American Art in Chattanooga, Tennessee and the Flint Museum in Michigan. So we are excited about that. Can't thank you enough for being so supportive and for the beautiful work that you share with the world. Thank you
You're welcome.
all.
It was a gift to us too.
Honored.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our viewers. We're so happy you were able to join us. I'll just mention we have another wonderful fantasy related show coming up. Opening on November 13th, we have an exhibition of the art of illustrator Jan Brett, Stories Near and Far. And so we look forward to that exhibition this fall and over the holidays. So hope to see you all again soon.
All
And
right.
thank you again.